Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast. I'm your podcast host, Peter Ahmad, recording from Cape Town, South Africa since June 2019. The Talking Transformation podcast provides an open and accessible platform for built environment professionals and interest groups to share their reflections and aspirations relating to the transformation of places and spaces in South Africa. It's intended to be a celebration of the individuals and community groups who are supporting formal and informal processes that are addressing the challenges of South Africa's history and shaping the future of our neighbourhoods and cities. I've been wanting to speak about the Open Streets initiative even prior to this podcast launching in mid-2019. If you're a regular listener, you've already heard from one of the drivers of the Open Streets initiative in one of our previous episodes, from Marco Giretto. Not only was Marco a director supporting the initial years of Open Streets, but he was also the designer of our Talking Transformation podcast logo. I remember coming in to speak to him in the office at the Cape Town Civic Centre and saying, we are going to do a podcast, you and me together. And sadly, it would only launch after he left South Africa with his family for Australia. But the idea of an episode looking at the work and purposes of Open Streets was one of the reasons I launched this platform. Still very much consider him the patron saint of the Talking Transformation podcast. Likewise, his enthusiasm for Open Streets was so infectious and genuine, it was really difficult not to get swept up in the transformation thinking and the ambitions of this collective. Open Streets is a citizen-driven collective working towards improving the equitable design and use of public space and streets for all users. It was introduced in 2012 by a group of volunteers committed to a more equitable, integrated, safer and vibrant Cape Town. The very premise of spatial transformation and equity, of enhancing spaces and linking places, is entrenched in their efforts and thinking. Even during COVID-19, the period of lockdown here in South Africa, the Open Streets team was looking for avenues and approaches to embrace community mobilisation and the activation of streets and public spaces, frequently with the ambition of a temporary car-free day and activities. In Nyanga, Mitchell's Plain, the Central Business District of Cape Town are all initiatives that have been driven by Open Streets. Today I'm absolutely delighted and privileged to discuss the work and achievements of Open Streets to date with Managing Director of the organisation, Kirsten Wilkins. She's an experienced urban designer by trade and very much epitomises the credo of the organisation. You can only be caught up in the passion she has for cycling, for spatial and mobility justice and making safer spaces for people. As we approach World Bicycle Day on June the 3rd, I really wanted to finally add the Open Street story to the Talking Transformation podcast archive. Absolutely delighted that we've been able to get this episode recorded and the story told. As always, hope you enjoy the episode. This one's for you, Marco. So it's just gone 11:30 on May the 23rd, Monday morning, and I'm joined today in person, live, for the first time in I think 2 and a bit years that we've done a person-to-person recording since the time of COVID. Absolutely delighted to welcome Kirsten Wilkins. She and I have just been out for a ride up to Melkbos and back. It was a fantastic way to spend a Monday morning. How are you this morning, Kirsten? Did you enjoy our ride?
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, thanks for having me here. It was so wonderful to be out and just enjoying kind of winter sunshine and just remembering that actually winter is not a terrible time to ride a bike. It was glorious and the ocean smell was amazing and we had infrastructure to ride on, so I was very happy.
It was beautiful. Blue sky, blue sea, the mountain looking fantastic. And we tested out some of the infrastructure, some of the cycling infrastructure here in the city, and I'm sure that'll come up in our conversation. But really what we're here today to talk about is the Open Streets initiative. That's been something that's been going for about a decade or more here in Cape Town, and I've been wanting to have this conversation with you and the Open Streets team for many, many years to understand a bit more about it and to really understand how it's helping integrating places and shaping our communities. Tell me a bit about the inspiration from Open Streets, how it came about, and how your involvement more directly has become so prominent now that you're the managing director.
Yeah, I think the one thing that is always wonderful to explain when explaining Open Streets is that I'm the managing director of the organization at present, but Open Streets is really a movement. And I think the balance between holding the movement and moving the organization forward is quite an important balance to reach. I think for anyone who's working in the Open Streets space, we've been operating as an organization for just over 10 years now. I think we've just moved past our 10-year anniversary. And it really has been about this balance between pushing forward, but also honoring the efforts and the volunteerism and the many, many allies and advocates that we have in the city transformation space as we all sort of push forward to try and transform spaces and transform streets in the city of Cape Town. My involvement really started as a volunteer in the organization and being part of the movement, and then sort of graduating up into the organization as a whole, and just honoring those efforts of volunteers from the past.
Am I right in saying, Kirsten, that the inspiration came from an international model, some of the things that we might have seen in South America? And so is that how Open Streets came about and adapted within a South African context?
Yes, very much so. So the Open Streets model is based on the ciclovia model of Latin American countries. And really it's grown quite extensively. I think on any given Sunday, there's probably 25 to 30 different cities around the world who are opening streets for people. So it's really grown, particularly in the US. So the ciclovia model was always something that we'd wanted to explain to the city of Cape Town, explain to people like streets can be different. But of course that model has had to adapt to a South African context, and particularly a Cape Town context, where something as normal as closing streets to cars in a Latin American context is quite event driven here, and there's a lot of legislation that comes into play. So we have to adapt to normalizing it within the construct of Cape Town kind of rules and regulation.
The Open Streets initiative here in South Africa started in Cape Town.
Yes.
Has it expanded yet to other cities, other places within South Africa, Southern Africa perhaps?
Yeah, so we worked a lot with teams in Johannesburg, a team in Durban, folks who've just really approached us and said, we saw what you were doing in Cape Town, help us to do that here. So there's been a gentle footprint in South Africa, but in 2018, 2019, we worked with a group called the Africa Exchange, where we brought together people from around sub-Saharan Africa to Cape Town to experience an Open Streets Day. We went through the toolkit of how to organize it and really tried to mobilize Open Streets Days in other cities. So now you can go to Open Streets in Kampala, you can go to Open Streets in many cities in Ethiopia. So it's really grown. And as each city and each country takes on the idea of what an open street movement is, it becomes quite specific to that place. And I think that's really the secret sauce, is that it's not, replicable without identity. I think people really take it to heart and embed it in the culture and the spaces and the places of those particular cities. And it starts becoming magical and quite separate from us, which is really a joy for me to see that it's not what we spoke about or what we shared. It's just become an extension of city life and public space potential in the various cities where we've tried to mobilize Open Streets Days and removing cars to make spaces for people.
It's about more than just removing the cars. It's about more than cycling and so forth. It really is about the public access to space and safety elements. These are all part of, I guess, the broader advocacy campaign that Open Streets is lobbying for. And
initially, people ask me if I'm, if I hate cars and we're the anti-vehicle movement. But really, I think we look at a public space or a space that could be public, and we say, okay, well, who's got the loudest voice? Who is occupying that space in a way that makes less place for others to be themselves? And most of the time, that bully in the room, if you like, is car access and car use and car centricity. It's not always the case. Safety and security, street lighting, all of those things where we think, how can we make a public space more equitable and more accessible? It might not just be removing cars that's necessary. And so we look at each space quite differently. And sometimes removing cars isn't really necessary at all. So it really depends on the space and the people. When we had Open Streets Day in Nyanga for the first time, we've been there twice. We've been to Voortrekker Road, we've been to Mitchell's Plain. Twice in Mitchell's Plain, actually quite different experiences. The first Open Streets Day in Nyanga was the highlight. I was volunteering there at the time and kind of I felt like I was working quite hard. I stopped for a moment to ask an event organizer what she was doing, and she said that she'd set up a little table with like crayons and this little dinky plastic chairs for kids, and she had this like washing line of these letters on it, and she said that she was creating a space for children to write thank you letters to their school teachers, and that was like her gift to the Open Streets movement. And I had a look at some of these letters, and it was so beautiful, and school teachers kind of came up and found these sort of anonymous letters, or it was just a sense of encouragement and love and belonging. And that for me, I think, just made me want to stay at Open Streets forever, because it was an opportunity for people to do that in public space, which is not business, which is not culture, it's not, music festival. It's just people seeing people and saying, I appreciate you.
You made mention of a toolkit, and that's obviously something that's been developed over many different events, many different locations in Cape Town. Can you tell us a bit about what would you find in that? And again, somebody who might be listening to this who has not, for example, been experienced one of the Open Streets events and would say, but the toolkit, that sounds interesting. I would like to try and do something with this in my own community.
Yeah, it's really quite comprehensive, and I have to give a shout out to everyone who's involved in making that happen. It's absolutely comprehensive, from how do you start to what would you be doing in week 4 of 12. We even have templates for letters that you'd send out to government officials, how to put together safety and security plans. It's everything that you would need to organize an event where you're creating a public space where people can belong. So that's kind of one aspect, but also the legislative and legal requirements of creating an event space where you're removing cars from a space. I was quite curious about the toolkit myself. So when I initially came on at Open Streets, I used the toolkit to organize the first Open Streets Day that I sort of ran as operational manager at the time, to test if it really was something you could walk into and use as a first-time person to organizing an event. And it really is quite user-friendly and has everything you need there sort of step by step. What was amazing to me, and I think is important to point out, is that the majority of the organizing is actually community engagement and making sure that everyone feels like they belong and everyone feels like they can contribute. And I think that really is the difference between an Open Streets Day and an event where cars are removed. A lot of events you'll see will have public space that is created by removing whatever was there previously. But we really feel that communities need to be involved and people need to be able to use that space for expression and local business development and everything that's possible. And we need to make as many opportunities as possible for people to be able to step forward. And so you'll see the toolkit goes through that in quite a lot of detail. So even if you're not opening a street to people, that community engagement portion of the toolkit might be interesting to people who want to engage as communities and create spaces of belonging.
I think we're very fortunate here in the Western Cape and Cape Town, given that Premier Windy is a big cyclist. He's been a big advocate of cycling. I would argue some of the best infrastructure, with some of its own challenges, but some of the best cycling infrastructure in South Africa. What has been the reaction, the response from that political dimension, and how important is that concept of political will in backing initiatives like Open Streets, in making sure that some of those regulations, some of those bylaws set aside and so forth to assist you on the day's event? So yeah, your general feeling around the reaction to and the response of government to initiatives like Open Streets.
Yeah, I think there's sort of 3 aspects to that question that I think are worth chatting about. I think the first is the receptivity of government to innovation, to here's a different idea, this is a different way of doing things. Some government officials and political leadership may or may not be receptive to innovation all the time. And that ebbs and flows. And I think it's very important to know that there's certain times of the year, there's certain pressures that government's under where they're more or less likely to be receptive to innovation. And so it's important to be sensitive to that. But when that sensitivity and the receptivity to innovation is open, then what I find very important is, it's one thing to explain an idea to somebody and to have them listening. I mean, Open Streets makes so much sense. It's like, don't get killed by a car and give everyone an opportunity to live their best life in public space. It sort of seems like a no-brainer. But at the same time, for a political will to move from an endorsement to implementation, the key there is experience, is to take somebody who needs to make that decision and who's going to be responsible for the outcomes of that decision, to first experience what it is that we're trying to reach. That's sort of the holy grail of what safe public space feels like. And so a lot of my work, I feel, is to help to create pockets of that future possible, so that something as large as Open Streets can be received well, because we've sort of planted these sort of nuggets of wonderful public space experience, of wonderful cycling experience, of social cohesion, where you think, wow, if only South Africa was like this every day. And so I think experience really is the secret sauce there, is bringing political will into a place where that person making that decision is going to take responsibility for something innovative because they believe it in their hearts as well as in their heads. And I think that's something that is a sort of a slow attrition from an advocacy point of view, but quite reachable if we're creative. So A good example of something that we're doing in that respect is World Bicycle Day. So we're doing a great social ride where we can get people on a bike for the first time. They can see it's fun. They can see that it's safe and wonderful and an alternative. That's one of those experience nuggets that moves political will closer to making longer term decisions about bigger projects that involve cycling, public space and social cohesion.
How do we start to think about modal shifting people out of cars, whether it's into mass transit, whether it's the BRT, rail, which we know has got its own challenges, or seeing more and more people using a carbon neutral mode like cycling, like walking. Many of our communities, particularly lower income, having to walk long distances to access taxis or other public transportation infrastructure. That's a reality for many of our communities. How do we address this idea of modal shift? And is it realistic saying we're going to see a wholesale shift? Other cities have done it, but I always get that sense that there's still this idea that cycling in South Africa is for those who with money, who can afford the lycra and the kit, versus this is a means of getting back and forth to work. Interestingly enough, on our ride today, we experienced a rider clearly on his way to work with a very dilapidated bicycle, literally the wheel falling out of the axis. That's his means of transport, but it's very different to what you and I were riding. And his experience today, even on that cycling infrastructure, is not going to be a good one. He's got his own challenges that are real. So how do we address this issue of equity within the equation, and that sort of the skepticism that I guess is there of saying, but you'll never force somebody out of the car, and particularly South Africa, where the car often is seen as a status symbol. People have worked hard for that and see that as a measure of success, that I've made it in my community, in my neighbourhood. These are real challenges, and I'd really be interested to get your take on that, Kirsten.
There's a lot to sort of answer in that question. There might be a plausible solution in front of you that could answer a number of challenges that you might have. But I think in the South African context, where so many people are surviving day to day, and it might not just be like a financial survival, it's also just like a mental health survival, how much time is available, just getting home before dark so that you're not in a kind of a precarious kind of crime situation. The uptake of a new idea or making a change is very, very onerous when people are surviving. And I almost think that the transport and traffic conversation needs to step back and just really recognize that the majority of the people in our city are surviving. And what kind of decisions would people make if they were surviving? Like, do I have time to experiment with the bike? Like, how comfortable is it? Do I have time to take a Sunday to go figure out what my route is to work? Those are not solutions that are open to people who have challenges with childcare and are working another job on a Sunday. So I think when it comes to the shift of modal shift, we need to make it as easy as possible for people to make that decision and for that to be clear, rather than expecting people to put in the legwork to make a sort of a massive shift. I think the city can do a lot in terms of making options available that are not just safe options when you decide, but helping to gentle people into something like an alternative where they don't have to do the legwork, because it really is a day-to-day survival situation out there for most people. And I think it would help us so much if we started by addressing how difficult it is just to make it through Monday and not even have to think about, okay, well, let me change my life up. No one's trying to level up. We're just trying to make it through. And I think that recognition is just one way that there can be a duty of care in the transport space.
Are the challenges in Cape Town the same as, for example, Johannesburg, Durban, Port Elizabeth, in respect of topography, climate, those type of things, which I guess would impact on people's decisions? Have we seen best practice and some real examples of that shift happening in other cities? Just the network, what is the feedback that you're getting from the more global non-motorized transport environment in South Africa?
The challenge for Cape Town, and maybe the learnings from other cities, is just we're not as upfront about just recognizing survival. The impact of apartheid spatial planning is something that I believe should be in every conversation about how we move, about how we live. And what is challenging in Cape Town is that the historic CBD, the core, is also very much a catalyst and still a holding space for the difference between who has and who hasn't. So investments in the city bowl, in the CBD, skewed towards one demographic and lifestyle band benefiting from certain infrastructure investments, where people who live on the peripheries really are living on the peripheries of the city because of being marginalized historically. Not all South African cities have that difference that is quite as spatial. There are really wonderful examples, like in Johannesburg, for example, where cycling infrastructure around like Diepsloot, coming out of communities and clubs of people who cycle on weekends but also commute, that's very normalized. And I think that, we can learn a lot by just stopping focusing on Cape Town as a historic core of economic opportunity, because it just really reinforces skewed investment in the city. And I think that makes it difficult for really great infrastructure and really great solutions to emerge in places where they're most necessary, I would say, which is where people don't have access to cars as the norm, where people are walking far as the norm. So I think it's worth looking at cities that are sort of skewed geographically in terms of where investment is happening, because I do think that it's very polarized in Cape Town, and it's super obvious, and we really just need to address that in every single meeting that we have. I think we can't step around it like we used to.
How do the different concepts of mobility, and I'm thinking here in relation to non-motorized transport, or NMT as it's often referred to, universal access being something slightly different, and the protection and enhancement of public open space, which is becoming increasingly challenging in terms of privatization of that open space. How are these sort of three concepts that come to my front of mind start to shape open streets, advocacy work and thinking? And how do they differ and overlap between, let's say, the universal access, the NMT and the commons and so forth?
I think one of the first principles around open streets as an organization and how we advocate for something that's not what is now, I think is really centering people and the owners of space and the people who use the space before the efficiencies of infrastructure. Car efficiency is, of course, where the majority of investment is going in our road spaces. So to say people getting there faster means that we need to think about who is the space for, how can we use it differently, how can people feel safe. So I think really Open Streets is one of many organizations that looks at people centricity, but at an urban level. And that includes universal access, understanding who's walking and cycling, who has access to other modes of transport, and just making sure that people can get from their origin point to their destination safely, and wanting to do that again the next day, and that trip doesn't come at a cost to them, whether it's overly financial cost or emotional or from a safety and crime prevention point of view. So I think it's really about people centricity first, and public spaces, or those shared spaces that we have really few opportunities to really connect with positively people in the city that are curated and shared. And I think if we really mapped out the spaces where that happens, I think we'd be shocked to see how few spaces those are. I mean, we think shopping is a public thing. It's not. It's all privatized. Streets and roads we have a minimal access to meet someone new and connect with somebody and realize that South Africa is a diverse place. Even nature reserves and places that are protected and conserved have an entry-exit point that by its very nature excludes some people and makes other people feel very welcome. So there are very, very few public spaces, and I think if we map those out, I think we'd get a bit of a fright as to how public space poor we are. If you map out how much space we have for mobility, it's massive. What if we could be great people together and change how we move? And that's really where Open Streets shines. But there are lots of other people who work in a similar space who we collaborate with because they do some of these things better. I'm not a universal design expert, but I know that needs to be the first question, because if everyone's not welcome, we may as well not even start.
So what does a good example of that look like in your experience, whether it's here in South Africa or internationally? What does a good public space look like with good infrastructure for non-motorized transport, universal access and the like? Where has inspired you personally?
One of my favorite cities is Chicago, and I think I'd probably point there because Chicago is quite car-centric. Actually, the whole of the US, but it's a very car-centric place. It has a very beautiful promenade waterfront area where people can behave a certain way and move and recreate in a certain way. But then there is also, I think it's called Millennium Park in central Chicago. And that is a beautiful green open space and really accessible to everybody. And I think what makes it so special, and that whole area of Chicago so special, is that it has the memory of freedom building and democracy sort of built into it. So whenever you walk past there, you're not only in a great public space, but you're constantly remembering these great things that happened there. And I think that memory is one of the aspects of infrastructure that we don't use as a tool. I remember things that happen in public spaces every time I move past them. And if we can create really great memories for people, we're sort of layering infrastructure and experience in great public spaces. And I think Chicago's done that really well as a city that sort of stepped out into Obama's presidency to make public space available for people to speak out. That combination of safety, accessibility, and memory is a very beautiful and quite evocative combination for me.
Are there opportunities that perhaps we're not maximizing to leverage the public transport and the non-motorized transport and getting those modes working better? At the moment, my sense is that they're quite separate things designed separately, even where you've got, for example, in Cape Town, most of the bus rapid transit lanes have also got parallel cycle infrastructure. But in terms of the way they operate, it always seems to be quite disconnected. Any thoughts, observations, as somebody's working in that space and advocating? Am I right in thinking that, or is it better than I imagine?
You know, when I look at city infrastructure, I sort of think like, well, how did that come to be? And when I look at the NMT rollout alongside the MyCity bus lanes and just related to the whole MyCity rollout, it's sort of, I think this was made by a very dysfunctional family that wasn't really talking. Maybe they don't have dinner together or they're not talking. It doesn't make sense to me that we'd have a beautiful cycle lane running parallel to a bus rapid transit system that you'd want people to be on. You know, it makes sense to have incredibly good cycling infrastructure leading to that and to those bus stops, to those infrastructure points, almost at 90 degrees to those. But to have infrastructure that serves the same group of people running in parallel, I'm not sure that I quite understand how that works. Maybe I didn't get the email on that. But I do think that we need to think about people experiencing and undertaking complete journeys rather than just an option of having a little bit of something somewhere. I think that the combination of rail and bus and cycling and walking needs to help people to get to where they need to be safer and quicker, rather than, you know, being these sort of separate siloed sort of divisions that might piggyback off each other. Some of that just really doesn't make sense to me. I don't know. Someone's going to have to explain why a cycle lane parallel to a MyCity bus is a really good idea when it could be serving a community elsewhere.
Tell us a bit about what's coming on June the 3rd.
So World Bicycle Day is one of those special days where you can take a bit of time, get your bike out of the garage, call a friend, maybe get your bike back from a friend. It's the day to just go, okay, let me do that thing. And what we're going to be doing on June 3rd is a ride that we actually host quite regularly, but we're just going to level it up. So every second Friday, we ride through the city on a social lunchtime ride called Friday City Cycles, where we try and do that thing. We try and say to folks who work in government, who work in the city bowl, say, come and ride with us during lunchtime and just see what that thing is that we're talking about. And then we ride alongside other people who are also great to meet. So it becomes a sort of a coffee date on wheels. So for World Bicycle Day, we're sort of kicking that up a couple of levels. We're going to have we've got a photo booth, we've got like free coffee and smoothies, and everyone's just sort of coming to the party. Also a lunchtime ride, short, 7 kilometers, very easy to do. Beginners are welcome. And if you don't have a bike, we can also help. We want to take away all of those barriers to entry as many as possible. And we'll be riding around the city and doing two things: showing safely in a group what less ideal infrastructure looks like. Not in an unsafe way, but just going, okay, this is one of the ways to do it. And then we'll be showing both people newer to cycling as well as officials and decision makers where those really great nuggets are. And the idea is that we stop focusing on the once-offs and those like golden nuggets of where it works and start making that the norm. So we're hoping to show you some sneaky routes around town and give you a free coffee, but also just connect you with people who also care. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, public spaces are only public when there are people in them, and bicycles only matter when people are riding them. And so we're trying to make a bicycle day where you meet great people who also care, and we'll see where it goes.
So just a reminder, that event is on the 3rd of June, and it's starting from and at what time?
Okay, so we're starting at 12:30 and we'll be done by 1:30. And we're starting from the corner of Lower Berg and Riebeek Street. There's a renovated building there called The Box, where the building owners have actually launched quite a nice setup where there's like showers for bicycle commuters. There's a safe lockup space for your bike so you can commute to that spot and then walk. We also just want to sort of say, hey, that's one of those golden nuggets where somebody's got retail space and they're turning it into a safe kind of upgraded parking spot for if you're riding into town. So it's one less thing for you to have to figure out. So we're going to be starting from there and then riding down to the waterfront and doing just a loop through the city. Lots of ringing bike bells, probably some terribly boppy music, but it'll be really, really fun. And we'll be doing that every second Friday. So if you loved it this time, there's an opportunity to do it again. And I think that consistency is also really important. We're going to be joined by the mayor, which it's always lovely to host him on a ride. We've ridden a couple of times together with Open Streets, and the MACO. And we've got some folks from provincial government as well. And as many people who want to know what that experience is that we're talking about, we'll be hosting them on a short, easy, fun ride so that we can stop talking about that future perfect and we can just have an hour of it and realize why everyone's making such a hoo-ha about cycling.
Sounds like one of the events that ultimately you want to try and start geolocating throughout the city. So that's not just the CBD, and ultimately but it's Khayelitsha, Nyanga, up towards Atlantis. I mean, there's obviously a whole range of opportunities. It'd be great to see if that can develop in due course. Any thoughts around shifting some of the geographic focus?
The location for the Friday City Cycle has always been because that's where a lot of the decision makers in our government are positioned, and it's the easiest access to that political will switch that we're trying to switch on, I guess, is that the right word? But absolutely, I think the thing for us that's really important is that just like this Open Streets toolkit, it's like because we're doing it doesn't mean that that's the thing that's happening. It's just like we figured the hard way out to do it and do it wherever you can. So if you've got decision makers in your local ward who you'd like to encourage to build cycling infrastructure, World Bicycle Day is a great time to take a cycle around your neighborhood with that person who has the ability to make a decision and take them to the spaces that they're making a decision about. I think that's the key thing, is getting decision makers and planners out from behind their desks and into those spaces on a bike.
The political dimension to the work that you do and the ambitions behind Open Streets and the mobility campaigns seems to have come to a head recently here in Cape Town. We try not to make the podcast about Cape Town, but has been interesting to see how the Sea Point Promenade issue and the desire of the city to close down some of the access to, for example, cyclists around there, that seemed to become a very hot potato very quickly. And I've no doubt you were inundated by stakeholders for your perspective and your input. What was your take on the issue, and how did you frame it from the get-go?
That really escalated and ended up being a very important focus point for us for this year. In one respect, Sea Point Promenade is the shared space for Cape Town at the moment. And, meeting people there, very few people there on a Saturday are actually from Sea Point. It's just this absolute haven of safety and shared space for our city. And I think people feel quite protective of that and are willing to speak out. And I enjoyed the active citizenry around that, that once people realized that how it is might not remain. So there was that aspect that was encouraging for me. But I also think the realization for me politically and why we sort of stepped up to really make a stand, and I think we really sort of felt this was going to be the hill we were going to die on, if that was the phrase, was that when sharing becomes problematic and when public space is working functionally well, when the city intervenes, I was hoping that it would be a supportive intervention, that it would be a collaborative intervention. It's quite busy on a Saturday. What are we going to do? And the response was extractive. Who should not be here? What should we take away? What should we pull apart? And I think for me that was, from an advocacy point of view, something that we needed to step towards and say, sharing is okay. And we can build more Sea Point Promenade-esque spaces rather than keeping this at what it could be by removing people or telling people who can't be here any longer. And I think that sort of extractive mentality for me is something that was highlighted in this advocacy effort and something that we really need to be aware of. If something needs an effort or needs to be helped along, that effort should be a sharing, helping effort and a collaborative effort, not one where we start sort of pulling apart who belongs and who doesn't. That's incredibly problematic.
To their credit, the city seems to have rolled back on those plans.
Yes, I'm very happy that that is the case, and I do think that from a communication point of view, both the political and the official sort of administrative side of the city were very, very forthcoming about how the process was unfolding. And so, to their credit, I think as much as there was a robust active citizenry taking part, I think there was a very robust process within the city, and I think those are both very, very healthy things. And I think probably the best thing to come out of the whole process is people care, people want to communicate, and it works both ways. It was very, very encouraging.
Advocacy in action, right there.
It was great, and I felt like we won. So there was that.
If we look now towards the Open Streets future, anything you'd like to share before we start working towards a close?
We've been really involved in the background with a lot of the street closure days that have been happening in the last 2 or 3 months with regards to restaurants having more spill-out space and the opportunity for the city to shift streets as being public space and serving various sort of interest groups, whether it's a party and observatory or drinks on Bree Street. But for us as Open Streets, we really want to go back to the heart of what it is that gave birth to the toolkit initially, which is, where are the spaces that are so hard to transform, where the people who need those spaces need the most encouragement. And so we are pointing our North Star towards District 6 for Heritage Day in September. I'm really hoping that that's going to come together. But I'm also holding onto it very gently because we're not hosting Open Streets. We're going to be facilitating the community of District 6 hosting Open Streets in the way that they would like it to be. And so I'm hoping that September will be a good timeline, but we really want to facilitate development of the work that we've been doing there, which is around design of streets, of restitution spaces. When we go back to somewhere where people have been forcibly removed and the city needs to invest in public space infrastructure and roads and streets. Like, how is that different? Like, how does memory, how does restitution turn into the day-to-day infrastructure of mobility and movement that we've been speaking about today? And we're really hoping that as Open Streets, we can create an experience where we can bring people together and start making that real and take those conversations out of offices and from behind desks and turn it into something that we can all experience together so that we can keep moving forward. So District 6 in September will be really, really wonderful. But as I say, we're really kind of approaching this with a kind of a serving heart. So as that develops, we'll be very happy to come alongside the people of District 6 and make that real.
Any other Open Streets days that you've got, or is District 6 the only one that you're planning at the moment?
Well, I think we've been holding off from putting sort of huge resources and infrastructure behind our regular Open Streets days through COVID, and being a bit more sort of supportive of communities at a smaller scale needing to kind of invigorate public space. So this will be the first, and I think my ideal outcome would be for us to be able to have a series of Open Streets days in District 6. So we can keep building on that. I wouldn't want to sort of parachute in and do something wonderful and move on. And so our dream is really a series in District 6 where we can just continue to build on that wonderful single day moment becoming a solid streets and public space future. So that really is where we're going. But I'm not 100% sure, but I'm kind of okay with that.
That's fantastic. Well, all the very best with District 6. All the very best with the World Bicycle Day on June the 3rd. And if anyone is listening there and wants to find out more about the work that you do and the Open Streets Initiative, how can they get hold of you via Twitter, websites, etc.?
Okay, so openstreets.co.za, our website would be the best place to go. We've got sort of a live connection to our social media streams on there, so you can pick up what we're saying today as well as what we've said in the past. We have a YouTube stream or channel that's got a lot of our previous material on it. So if you want to get a sense of what is an Open Streets Day, those experiences of other people and the stories that have been told before are very powerful. So that would be a really great resource to point towards. And then you can see it. You can find us on most social media channels. I think Instagram is the most fun and Twitter's the most adversarial. So I think pick a weapon of choice.
So in terms of your handles on those four?
So it'll be Open Streets CT is where you'll find us, yeah.
Well, Kirsten, from my side, this has been an absolute pleasure. Taking the ride, taking some of the sea air this morning, but more importantly, having a chance to finally sit down with you doing this in person and having a face-to-face conversation. Really enjoyed it. It's clear you've got a lot on your plate. All the best. And thanks so much for taking some time to be with me today. Really appreciate it, and all the best.
Thank you so much, Pete.
We hope you enjoyed this content of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please feel free to give us feedback via our Twitter platform. That's @TalkingTransfo and the number 1, or alternatively via our email address talkingtransformation101@gmail.com. Thanks and recognition also to Tribal Need for allowing us to use their track Flags as our introductory and closeout music on this podcast.